Elizabeth stood on the narrow Italian street, the cold night air pressing against her skin as James' car disappeared into the distance, leaving behind the echoes of his friends' laughter. Their cruel joke was more than just an insult. It was the beginning of her realization that she was on her own. She could hardly believe what had just happened, her heart still racing as she tried to make sense of their actions. With her purse clutched tightly, Elizabeth stood frozen for a moment, unable to process the abandonment. She looked to Elizabeth, who was still standing outside the cafe, mouth agape, her argument now irrelevant in the face of this betrayal. Locals around her began to notice, their stares making her feel even more isolated. She clung to the belief that James would come back to apologize, but as time passed, that hope began to slip away. Each minute that stretched into an hour only deepened the knot in her stomach. In the silence of the town, the charming Italian streets transformed into a suffocating maze. Elizabeth's mind raced as she checked her purse for cash, €80, which was hardly enough to make a dent in her predicament. She had nothing to rely on except her own wits and the hope that things would somehow work out. The hours stretched on as the sky darkened, and Elizabeth's mind turned over the harsh words she had heard that afternoon. Her phone, despite repeated attempts, only offered the cruel emptiness of voicemail. Her husband and his friends had blocked her. She was truly alone. The humiliation was palpable, and as she lay awake in the cheap pension above the bakery, she had to admit that this wasn't some temporary act of anger. It was a calculated decision. When she woke the next day, she forced herself to believe that James would return and everything would go back to normal. But he didn't. The second day was spent rationing what little money she had left, walking the streets, desperately hoping to find a sign of the tour group they had been with. As she looked for them, she realized they had already moved on, leaving her stranded, as if she had never mattered at all. On the third day, a kind cafe owner noticed her lingering near his shop and offered her free coffee. His sympathetic gaze did little to ease the feeling of being lost in a foreign land. He directed her to the local police station, but there, an officer seemed nonchalant about her situation, offering little help beyond a filed report. With no answers and no one to turn to, Elizabeth made a choice that would change her life forever. Her fingers trembled as she removed her wedding ring, the diamond that had once been a symbol of their commitment, now an object of exchange. The pawnbroker offered her a fraction of its value, but it was enough to take her to the next step. He suggested calling family, but Elizabeth couldn't bear the thought of facing them and admitting the truth. Her heart ached at the idea of explaining what had happened, of hearing her mother's voice tell her that she should have seen this coming. Instead, Elizabeth chose a different path. The bus station was a quiet place, its electronic board displaying destinations she had only read about in magazines. The idea of returning to her old life, calling her father for money to return home, was tempting, but it felt like giving in. She could no longer return to the life she had once built with James, a life that had slowly whittled away at her spirit. The ticket agent, an older woman with a kind face, asked where she was headed. Without hesitation, Elizabeth replied, Greece. She didn't know exactly where she would go or what she would find, but the decision felt liberating, as though she were finally free from the prison her marriage had become. As she boarded the bus, the uncertainty of the journey ahead filled her with a strange sense of peace. She was leaving behind a life that had suffocated her, one small step at a time. The future was unknown, but for the first time in a long while, Elizabeth felt like she was making a choice for herself, a choice that was no longer defined by James or the life they had built together. The woman she would become in Greece was yet to be revealed, but in that moment, Elizabeth knew she was no longer a passive passenger in her own life. She was finally taking control. As Elizabeth stepped off the bus, her body ached from hours of rigid, uncomfortable seating. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the earthiness of olive groves, a welcome contrast to the cramped interior she had just escaped. She squinted against the setting sun, staring at the village around her. Whitewashed buildings rose in neat rows, their facades almost blinding under the fading golden light. She tried to speak the name of the place, but the words seemed impossible to form, foreign and unrecognizable. Her phone, her only link to the outside world, was dead, its battery drained somewhere between countries. Her stomach growled in protest, But hunger was a distant worry compared to the weight of what had happened, what she had done, or what had been done to her. That weight pressed on her shoulders as she trudged down the dusty road. Her head buzzed with exhaustion, the 3 days of raw emotion taking their toll. She was tangled in feelings of rage towards James, the husband who had abandoned her. Fear of the unknown future ahead twisted her gut, and then, unexpectedly, she felt an odd sense of release. Liberation, a dangerous flicker of freedom that frightened her as much as it comforted her. She only had enough euros for a few nights in the cheapest room she could find. After that, she had no plan, no friends, no words in Greek beyond please and thank you. Still, she felt something stirring in her as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Aegean waters in hues of gold and pink. She stopped, for just a moment, and let the stillness of the world around her settle into her bones. A calm she hadn't known in years. Her legs ached as she kept walking, the Greek sun beating down harder on her skin. The sandals she wore, too delicate for such an ordeal, sliced into her feet with every step. Blisters formed beneath her skin, each painful reminder of her own recklessness. Her water had run out hours ago, and her energy was a distant memory. The world swirled, the heat pressing in around her like an unbearable weight, the hunger gnawing at her insides. Olive groves lined the path ahead, their leaves shimmering faintly in the breeze. She barely recognized it at first, too lost in her own body's betrayal. It was only when her knees buckled beneath her, and the earth rushed up to meet her, that she understood. The olive trees, the groves, everything seemed distant and unreal as she fell to the ground, the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. Her body gave in to the exhaustion. The sound of a voice broke through the haze, calling out to her, urgent and worried. Light lady, a pair of hands, rough with age, turned her over. Elizabeth blinked, the world around her spinning. She saw an elderly woman with a face carved by time, deep lines framing kind eyes that filled with concern. The woman spoke rapidly in a language Elizabeth didn't understand, her hands brushing Elizabeth's face in a gentle pat, offering a canteen of water. Elizabeth struggled to sit up, her head spinning, but the cool liquid revived her enough to stay conscious. The woman repeated her name. Margaret, she said, her voice soft, and then pointed to herself. Elizabeth, barely able to keep her eyes open, mimicked her weakly. Lisa, she whispered. Margaret's small frame proved stronger than Elizabeth expected as she helped her to her feet, supporting her as they began the slow trek uphill. With each step, Elizabeth felt more and more like a rag doll, her body betraying her with every motion. But she couldn't resist. She let Margaret guide her, unsure of what else to do. The farmhouse came into view, a stone building nestled among the olive trees. The scent of something savory filled the air as they reached the door. Margaret helped Elizabeth inside, where the warmth of the kitchen surrounded her. Herbs hung from wooden beams, their fragrant oils mixing with the rustic smell of something bubbling away on an ancient stove. Margaret guided her to a worn wooden table, a place where she could rest. The clink of metal met Elizabeth's ears as Margaret called out to someone. The door creaked, and an elderly man appeared, his face weathered by the sun and time, his silver mustache giving him a dignified look. He wiped his hands on a cloth, and Margaret pointed to him. Martin, she said, her voice more certain now. Martin nodded, his eyes observing Elizabeth with cautious curiosity. There was no immediate welcoming smile, but there was no hostility either. He didn't speak much. Margaret poured a glass of cool water and pressed it into Elizabeth's hands before offering her a bowl of soup. The warm steam rose, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something simple and comforting. Elizabeth's stomach growled loudly in protest, and she smiled weakly as Margaret returned a gentle grin. That night passed in a blur. Elizabeth's body ached, her exhaustion too great to focus. She attempted to explain herself through gestures, broken English, and eventually tears. Margaret nodded, as though she understood, though Elizabeth was certain she didn't grasp the full depth of her situation. Martin remained silent, watching, his attention unwavering as Margaret translated questions through her hands. They offered her a spare room, nothing extravagant, but clean and simple. The walls were whitewashed, and the narrow bed was covered with a handmade quilt. Too tired to refuse, Elizabeth collapsed into sleep, grateful for the rest her body so desperately needed. Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the welcoming aroma of fresh bread. Elizabeth blinked, confused for a moment, before realizing she was in a different place. Clean clothes, a simple cotton dress and cardigan, had been folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The fabric hung loosely around her frame, a welcome relief from the travel-worn clothes she had been wearing. Margaret beamed at her as she entered the kitchen, serving her strong coffee and fresh bread drizzled with olive oil and honey. Embarrassment quickly crept into Elizabeth's chest. The kindness these strangers had shown her was overwhelming. They had taken her in without question, fed her, clothed her. She felt like she owed them something, but what? She couldn't just accept their hospitality without offering something in return. She struggled with broken English, pulling up the translation app on her phone. With Martin's help, she tried to express her gratitude and her intention to return to the village. Margaret's face fell immediately when she heard this. She shook her head vigorously, pointing toward the window where rain began to fall softly. Then, she pointed to Elizabeth's blistered feet. "Stay," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm. It was one of the few English words she knew, and Elizabeth couldn't ignore the plea in her voice. Rest. For the next 3 days, Elizabeth tried to leave several times, but each attempt was met with gentle resistance. Once, purse in hand and shoes on her feet, Margaret intercepted her at the door. There was an expression on her face, hurt, as though Elizabeth's leaving would cause her pain. Margaret took her hand and led her to a small wooden box on the mantel. She opened it, revealing photographs. The woman's fingers trembled slightly as she pointed to one of the pictures, of a young woman with Margaret's eyes and Martin's smile. "Chloe," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling as she pointed far away. "Australia." Then, with a cradling motion of her arms, she indicated a child, her hand at waist height. "Grandbaby," she added, showing Elizabeth another photo of an infant. Her voice broke. "No, see." Elizabeth's heart ached. She understood now. Margaret saw in her the presence of her absent daughter, Chloe, someone to fill the space left behind. It wasn't manipulation. It was the rawness of a mother's loss. Elizabeth's throat tightened, and she nodded slowly, realizing the depth of the gesture. She placed her purse back on the hook by the door, deciding to stay, if only for a little longer. Elizabeth wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her temple. She crouched low, fingers trembling slightly as she reached for an egg nestled in the straw. The hen clucked in protest, and she hesitated. A warm, calloused hand covered hers, steadying her movement. Margaret nodded encouragingly. Elizabeth exhaled and, this time, moved slowly. The egg rested cool and smooth in her palm. She grinned, holding it up triumphantly. Margaret chuckled, turning back to her knitting as the mountain breeze lifted the laundry, the white sheets billowing like sails against the deep blue sky. At the vegetable garden, Elizabeth knelt beside the man, her hands hovering over the dark soil. He pointed to a tangle of green stems, then to a leafy herb nearby. She nodded, gripping the base of one plant and tugging. His sharp inhale made her pause. She looked down. Roots dangled from her fingers, their scent sharp and fresh. The wrong plant. He plucked another weed nearby and placed it in her hand, his nod firm but patient. She tried again, this time with care, and he grunted approvingly. Evenings were quiet. Margaret's knitting needles clicked rhythmically beside her while the man puffed slow, deliberate clouds of smoke from his pipe. Elizabeth stretched her legs out, sore muscles humming from the day's labor. The olive trees swayed gently in the twilight, their silhouettes stretching long across the earth. The bitterness inside her chest dulled, settling into something softer, something she didn't yet have words for. Sitting cross-legged on the porch, she and Margaret shelled peas, the pods snapping open with satisfying pops. Margaret's gaze lingered on her, thoughtful. She set a hand on Elizabeth's knee, then lifted her fingers, mimicking a plane soaring through the air. Elizabeth's breath hitched. She stared at the wrinkled hands before her, then let her own hands fall into her lap. The image of a sleek Boston brownstone surfaced, polished floors, pristine walls, James standing in the doorway, his smile practiced and distant. Her chest tightened. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. Words spilled out in a broken rush. Memories of controlled bank accounts, friendships left to wither, ambitions dismissed with a casual flick of his wrist. Tears traced paths down her cheeks, dropping onto the peas in her lap. Margaret squeezed her hand, her grip solid and grounding. She tapped her chest, then gestured at the farm, at Elizabeth. No words were needed. The offer was there. A place. A purpose. Elizabeth sniffled, inhaling shakily. She lifted her head, eyes burning but resolute. She glanced at the man working the olive trees and mimicked his movements. I stay. I work. Margaret's face lit up, her smile unfurling like dawn spilling over the hills. She patted Elizabeth's knee once more and returned to shelling peas, the motion easy, unhurried. As if nothing had changed. As if everything had. Before the sun rose, Margaret nudged her awake. Sleep clung to Elizabeth's limbs, but Margaret pressed folded clothes and a pair of heavy boots into her hands. The fabric smelled of the earth, of sweat and sun, of someone who had once stood where she stood now. She tugged the boots on and followed Margaret and the man into the darkness, the faint glow of morning barely tracing the outlines of the ancient trees. Margaret reached for a branch heavy with olives, her fingers combing through the leaves, sending the fruit tumbling onto the net below. Elizabeth mimicked her movement. Twigs snapped, leaves scattered, but few olives joined them. Margaret's lips pressed together, not unkindly. She adjusted Elizabeth's grip, demonstrating again. Elizabeth inhaled deeply, tried once more. This time, the olives fell in a soft, steady rhythm. By midday, her arms burned. Her palms, still soft with city life, were the first signs of blisters. Margaret took one hand in hers, turning it over with a wry smile. Boston lady hands. Elizabeth laughed breathlessly. Later, Margaret disappeared into the house, returning with a small jar. The scent of herbs and beeswax rose as she spread the cool balm across Elizabeth's raw skin. The sting eased instantly. Tomorrow, better, she promised. And she was right. Each day, the motion became smoother, the ache more manageable. Her hands toughened, her posture adjusted, her pace steadied. Soon, she worked beside them from dawn to dusk, sweat glistening along her brow, pride swelling with each growing pile of olives. The long wooden table beneath the pergola became another classroom. Margaret hunched over the olives, her eyes sharp, fingers swift as she sorted them into piles. Elizabeth followed her lead, her movements careful but uncertain. Margaret nudged her now and then, correcting without speaking. As the days passed, her nudges became less frequent. One evening, the man nodded at Elizabeth's work, his English rough but deliberate. You learn fast. The warmth of the compliment settled deep in her chest. In the kitchen, she hovered at Margaret's side, watching flour billow as strong hands kneaded dough. Margaret pressed her fingers into the mound, showing her the feel of it, the elasticity. Elizabeth copied her, pushing her palms into the dough, but the consistency remained off, too sticky or too dense. Margaret tore open a failed loaf, examining its texture before popping a piece into her mouth. Learning is waste. She handed Elizabeth a piece. Elizabeth hesitated, then took a bite. The bread was dense, unevenly cooked, but beneath the flaws, the taste of something real lingered. She swallowed, nodded. She tried again, and again. Her hands learned the rhythm, her mind unlearning the rigid perfection she once clung to. The meals here were different. Vegetables still warm from the sun, eggs gathered that morning, cheese from a neighbor's goats. No preservatives, no artificial flavors. Just food as it was meant to be. Her reflection in the small bathroom mirror caught her off guard. The angles of her face had sharpened, not from exhaustion but from work, from movement, from a life lived rather than managed. Her skin, once meticulously maintained with creams and serums, glowed from olive oil and sunlight. She lifted her hand, touching her cheek, the warmth of her own skin unfamiliar. For the first time in years, she recognized the woman staring back. As Elizabeth's days unfolded, she became more and more immersed in the rhythms of the olive grove, slowly mastering the nuances of its work. Her mornings began with the clinking of tools in Martin's hands, the creaking of the old wooden gate as they entered the groves. Together, they walked between the gnarled, ancient trees, their thick trunks twisted by centuries of growth. Martin would stop now and then, bending down to examine the soil, his hands rough as they sifted through the earth, explaining how the minerals and moisture levels affected the taste of the olives. He spoke in simple words, slow enough for Elizabeth to catch. His voice carried the weight of years spent working the land. Martin pointed to various sections of the grove, each representing a different type of olive. This one, he would say, is for the early harvest. It gives a stronger flavor, more bitter. Then, with a gesture to the next row, this one, for later, smoother, milder. Each lesson, whether on the olive trees or the pressing process, became a small victory for Elizabeth, one step closer to understanding the land that had become her home. Her hands, once unfamiliar with the tools of the trade, grew accustomed to the rhythm of the work, pruning the trees, plucking olives, and finally, watching Martin expertly press them into oil. The smell of the fresh oil was intoxicating, a deep green, earthy scent that seemed to seep into her skin. After a morning in the groves, they would return to the small stone building where the pressing took place. There, Margaret would be waiting, always with a calm smile, to teach Elizabeth the intricacies of the business side. Margaret explained the ledgers, the numbers scrawled across the pages, the dates and quantities of olives harvested, and the costs of supplies. At first, the numbers swirled in Elizabeth's head, but slowly, the spreadsheets took on meaning. She found herself understanding the flow of their small operation, how the olives turned into oil, the market for their products, and how everything balanced out. On the days when Martin was busy with the trees, Margaret would take Elizabeth into the tiny office, showing her how to manage the sales, the inventory, and even the simpler aspects of marketing their products. They discussed what worked and what didn't, which oils sold better, which customers preferred which flavors, and how they could expand their reach. Elizabeth could feel her confidence growing in this new role, her mind churning with ideas for the future of the business. A few weeks into her apprenticeship, they began preparing for the market day again. The night before, Elizabeth sat on the small porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, her hands busy knitting another scarf. She had mastered the craft, and this one, though still imperfect, felt like a piece of herself, something created with her own hands, a symbol of her journey. Margaret came to sit beside her, offering quiet companionship. The conversation was light, just the two of them knitting under the fading light. The next morning, they set up their table at the village market. The sun shone brightly, and the stalls bustled with life. Margaret and Martin arranged their goods, jars of olives, bottles of olive oil, and soap, all lined up neatly. Elizabeth was positioned at the front again, just as before. She felt a knot of nervousness tighten in her stomach as customers began to approach. She had learned much since her first market day, but speaking Greek, even with her improved vocabulary, still felt like a challenge. She greeted the first few customers hesitantly, her Greek words stumbling out awkwardly. But Margaret was right there beside her, guiding the conversation when Elizabeth faltered. The customers smiled warmly at her, and soon enough, the awkwardness melted away. Elizabeth's confidence grew with each transaction, each smile she exchanged, each bottle of oil that left their stall. By the time the market was nearing its end, she had sold more than she expected. As the crowd thinned out, Margaret handed Elizabeth an envelope with euros inside. "Your part," she said softly, her voice laced with quiet pride. Elizabeth stared at the modest sum in her hands. It wasn't much, not compared to the wealth of her past life, but it was hers, earned by her hands, through work that had nothing to do with James or the expectations he had imposed on her. This money, small as it was, symbolized something far greater than she had imagined when she first arrived here. That evening, Elizabeth lay in bed, the envelope tucked under her pillow, feeling the weight of it there, tangible and real. The independence it represented was a stark contrast to the control James had once exerted over every part of her life. She hadn't thought of him all day, not while at the market, not during the transaction, and certainly not as she worked with Margaret and Martin. Her thoughts had been fully immersed in the land, the business, the new life she was slowly but surely building. The next week, a new chapter began when Margaret and Martin invited her to dinner at the local taverna. The excitement of the invitation sent a flutter of nerves through her, but she accepted. Dressed in a blouse borrowed from Margaret, Elizabeth felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. She had never been to a dinner with Mark, the taverna owner, and the idea of socializing in this small village felt both thrilling and intimidating. When they entered the taverna, the familiar sounds of clinking glasses and laughter filled the air. Mark greeted them warmly, his embrace of Margaret and Martin full of familiarity and affection. When his eyes turned to Elizabeth, they were full of curiosity. She felt herself shrink a little, unsure of how to be in this new world of village life. But Margaret's words reassured her. "Our American," she said with pride, speaking in the Greek that Elizabeth was beginning to understand. The introduction, though simple, made Elizabeth feel like she belonged here, at least for this moment. They sat down, and the meal began. Grilled fish, salad, and rustic village wine filled their plates. Conversation flowed easily between Margaret and Martin, but then the topic shifted. Martin cleared his throat, his face serious. "Alexis," he said, addressing Elizabeth directly, "we want to talk business." The sudden shift in tone caught Elizabeth off guard. What could this mean? Had she done something wrong? Was this her time to leave? Margaret reached across the table and patted her hand, giving her a reassuring smile before continuing the conversation. "We old now," Margaret said, gesturing between herself and Martin. 68, 70 years. No children. Here, Chloe not coming back. The weight of her words hung in the air. Martin nodded solemnly, adding, "We think retires soon, in 2-3 years. But the trees," he gestured widely, indicating the vast olive groves. "They need young hands." Elizabeth's heart skipped. The meaning was slowly becoming clear. "Business yours," Margaret said, spreading her hands as though offering a gift. "You learn fast. You work hard. We teach everything." The offer took her breath away. How could they want her, someone who had barely known them a few months? Yet, their offer was sincere. It was a path she hadn't even dreamed of, but one that now beckoned before her. But doubts crept in, and she voiced them. "But I don't know enough," she stammered. "The trees, the pressing, the business side." "You learn," Martin assured her. "We teach. No rush." And so, the apprenticeship began in earnest. Each day, whether in the groves or the office, Elizabeth grew more confident, no longer just a visitor, but an integral part of the olive business. She worked side by side with Margaret and Martin, her skills blossoming with each lesson. The inheritance of knowledge became her new reality, one built on labor, trust, and a future she now felt capable of shaping. The cursor hovered over the email subject line, her breath shallow, fingers trembling as she clicked. The words on the screen blurred for a moment before sharpening into focus, each one slicing through the fragile calm she had built. Lisa, the name she hadn't heard in months. The name she had discarded along with everything else from her past life. The walls of her small room pressed in around her, the air suddenly too thick, too heavy. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the distant clatter of Margaret washing dishes downstairs. The screen glowed with James's message, cold and impersonal despite the weight of its meaning. "Backwater. Ridiculous tantrum. Be ready." A sharp inhale caught in her throat, fury rising like a tide, crashing against the brittle edge of her lingering fear. Her hands tightened around the phone. Then, suddenly, she was moving, shoving the device into her pocket as her feet carried her downstairs, her movements clipped and uneven, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. Margaret glanced up from the ledger, the warmth in her expression fading the moment she saw Elizabeth's, no, Lisa's, face. The older woman's fingers stilled on the worn pages. "Bad news from America?" Elizabeth, because that was who she was now, forced the words out, her voice hoarse. "James. He's coming here. Thursday." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darkening with something unreadable. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching beneath the ledger and pulling out an envelope, its edges slightly worn from waiting. She slid it across the table. Good timing, then. Elizabeth hesitated before picking it up, the paper firm beneath her fingers. Inside, legal documents bore her name alongside Margaret's and Martin's, the Greek words softened by an English translation. Partnership agreement. The air seemed to still around her. 1/3 business yours now, Margaret said, her voice steady. Not future. Now. The words settled deep, a warmth spreading through her chest, tingling with the ache of uncertainty. This wasn't just a lifeline, it was a claim, a stake, a choice. Margaret tapped the papers, her gaze unwavering. You choose what happens Thursday. Then, a glance at the phone still clutched in Elizabeth's hand. That man, he no longer decides. Elizabeth exhaled, slow and measured, as the weight of the document grounded her. James was coming, but he would not find the woman he had left behind. The days that followed unfolded with a purposeful rhythm. Elizabeth went about her work with a quiet resolve, every action taken in preparation for what lay ahead. No frantic packing, no tearful farewells, just the steady fortification of her mind and spirit. She visited the lawyer in the village, sitting across from him as he carefully drafted the divorce papers, making sure they were accurate in both Greek and English. The weight of the words on the paper didn't feel like an ending, but a new beginning. With each stroke of the pen, she felt herself reclaiming something she had thought lost forever. She made contact with her former design mentor, cautiously accepting the remote consulting opportunity that would bring a bit of her old world into the new one. She also wrote emails to the friends she had left behind, offering brief but candid explanations, free of apologies. Her life had changed in ways that could never be undone. Thursday came with a sky so blue it seemed as though the gods themselves had painted it, the sun blazing down without a cloud in sight. The workday was like any other, Elizabeth and Martin in the processing shed, testing olive oil samples, the quiet hum of the workday surrounding them. But then, the sound of a car engine disturbed the tranquility. A rental car. The unexpected noise broke the steady rhythm of the afternoon. Margaret appeared at the door, her face serious but resolute. "He is here," she said, her words simple, but their weight heavy. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the door. Outside, standing next to the silver sedan, was James. His appearance hadn't changed, still the immaculate figure she remembered, the designer sunglasses perched on his perfectly styled hair, a look of disdain on his face as he took in the humble farmhouse. His expensive travel outfit stood in stark contrast to the rough surroundings. It was the same look he had worn during business trips, tailored chinos and a button-down shirt that likely cost more than a month's worth of their olive oil profits. He hadn't seen her yet, giving her a few precious moments to steel herself for the confrontation. She called his name, James. His head turned, and the shock on his face was almost laughable. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, pausing briefly on her work boots, then lingering on her sun-kissed arms. She could feel his eyes rake over her unstyled hair, which was pulled back simply. She saw the recognition hit him, and it clashed with disbelief. "My God, Lisa, what happened to you?" The words came out in that familiar disapproving tone, a voice that once would have made her second-guess everything. But now it just rolled off her. "Life happened," she answered calmly, walking toward him with measured steps. "What are you doing here, James?" He removed his sunglasses, slipping into his practiced charm. "I've come to take you home, of course. This has gone on long enough. Don't you think?" Elizabeth didn't move closer. She stopped well outside his reach, her gaze steady. "This isn't about making a point," she said, her voice firm. "This is about making a life." Behind her, she heard the soft shuffle of Margaret and Martin as they emerged from the house, standing silently in the background, ready to act if necessary. James noticed them, his eyes narrowing. "Are these the people you've been staying with? Have they been holding you here?" "Teaching me," Elizabeth corrected him. "About olive farming, about community, about kindness without conditions." She gestured toward the groves, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I'm part owner now. I have a business here." His face betrayed disbelief, quickly followed by the familiar air of condescension. "A business, Lisa? Be serious. You're a designer, not a farmer. This is what, some eat, pray, love phase." Elizabeth's face softened, but her voice was unwavering. "After our fight, I shouldn't have left you in Italy. It was a stupid, drunken mistake. I've apologized. Now it's time to come home." His eyes flickered with annoyance. "You've apologized?" he asked. "When? In what universe does tracking me down and demanding I return count as an apology?" Her voice sharpened. "Fine. I'm sorry I left you in Italy. It was immature and wrong. Is that what you want to hear? Can we move past this now?" he asked, his charm slipping. Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. She asked, "Why did you even look for me, James? It's been months. Why now?" He hesitated, his eyes darting over to the elderly couple standing nearby, watching quietly. His shoulders slumped, the facade of control crumbling just slightly. Can we discuss this privately in the car, perhaps? They don't speak English, and I have nothing to hide from them, Elizabeth replied, standing her ground. Why now? His shoulders dropped, as if the weight of his excuses was finally sinking in. Your parents have been calling, friends asking questions at events, clients wondering why you're not at the house when they visit. It looks, his voice trailed off. Bad for your image? Elizabeth finished for him, her tone sharp. Damaged your reputation, he corrected, his voice tight. Our reputation. Elizabeth let out a slow breath, frustration rising. The life we built together, you mean? The one where I gradually became nothing more than an accessory to your success? Tell me, James, did you even notice how unhappy I was before Italy? Did you care? His expression darkened, a flicker of guilt passing through him before he masked it with defensiveness. We had a good life, Lisa. A beautiful home, financial security, respect in the community. What more could you possibly want? She gestured to the house behind her, her voice calm but firm. Purpose, connection, agency over my own choices. Her eyes were steady as she continued. I found all three here, in a place you dismiss as primitive and backward. This isn't you, he insisted, his desperation creeping in. The Lisa I know wouldn't choose manual labor and poverty over comfort and position. Elizabeth smiled, but it wasn't a smile of affection. You're right, she said softly. The Lisa you knew wouldn't have. But that woman died in Italy when her husband abandoned her as a joke. The woman standing before you made different choices. Just then, Margaret stepped forward, pressing a folded document into Elizabeth's hand. She didn't need to speak. Elizabeth knew the moment had come. She unfolded the partnership agreement and held it up for James to see. I have legal ties here now, she said simply. A business partnership. Responsibilities to people who value me for my contributions, not my appearance or social connections. James's face flushed with anger, and he scoffed. This is ridiculous. Whatever game you're playing. It's not a game, Elizabeth interrupted, reaching into her pocket for the envelope the lawyer had prepared. These are divorce papers, James. Already filed, with provisions for division of assets. He stared at the envelope in disbelief. You can't be serious. You'd throw away everything for this. I'm not throwing away anything, Elizabeth replied firmly. I'm choosing something better. Something real. Without a word, she stepped forward and placed the envelope in his rigid hand. You left me, James. You drove away laughing. You just never expected I'd find my way without you. His fingers closed involuntarily around the divorce papers. His expression shifted through shock, anger, and then finally, wounded pride. You'll regret this, he warned, but the words lacked conviction. When the novelty wears off and you're still hauling olives in the hot sun at 60, you'll remember what you gave up. Maybe, Elizabeth answered, her voice calm. But I'd rather risk regret from choices I made than live with the certainty of regret from choices made for me. As if on cue, Martin stepped forward, his weathered hand resting gently on Elizabeth's shoulder. Though he couldn't understand their conversation, he could read the finality in their body language. He said something in Greek to James, his voice firm but not unkind. What did he say? James asked, his voice now quieter, smaller. He said the road back to Athens is dangerous after dark, Elizabeth replied. You should leave now to reach the city before nightfall. James looked between the three of them, finally realizing that this wasn't a negotiation or an opportunity for him to fix anything. Goodbye, he muttered, turning on his heel and walking back to his rental car. Without another word, he drove off, the silver sedan disappearing down the dirt road, the divorce papers still clutched tightly in his hand. Margaret slipped her hand into Elizabeth's, and together, the three of them turned toward the house. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was Elizabeth's home, too. The evening's work awaited, more olive oil samples to catalog, dinner to prepare, tomorrow's market inventory to check. Her husband had once abandoned her, convinced she would crumble without him. He never anticipated that, by trying to break her, he would have set her free. And now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elizabeth realized that this place, this life, was everything she had longed for, and so much more. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales. Join me on this journey of storytelling. There's so much more to come. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the next adventure.